Welcome to Long Island Community Spotlight on WRHU 88.7 FM and on the World Wide Web, WRHU.org. My name is Basha, and my co-host is Brian Simpson, a community in the center of Nassau County, Westbury.
And that's just the start of it. Joining us in the studio today, once again, is Mayor Peter Cavallaro, the mayor of Westbury. Welcome to the Spotlight.
Thank you. It's always good to be here with you.
Mr. Mayor, let's talk about the changes in the Smart Growth Program and the vision for Long Island, the vision for Westbury especially.
I'm always happy to talk about Westbury. I grew up in Westbury, and it's something which is obviously near and dear to my heart. But, we've started, I would say, probably about 8-9 years ago, taking a real hard look at our downtown like other communities have, and thinking about some of the smart growth principles that people like to talk about in terms of having walkability of your downtown and being proximate to a train station and some of the aesthetic aspects that you need in your downtown. And we started a program. We made a conscious decision to start a program to encourage our redevelopment of our downtown. And over the last 8 or 9 years, we've developed multifamily residential properties in the downtown area, which have really then helped us redevelop the commercial properties. And if you go down Post Avenue today, as opposed to maybe if you would have gone down it 10 years ago, I think you see a tremendous difference. And people tell me all the time, what a transformation it's been, and are really impressed by the visual difference between then and now. But that was just a conscious effort on the part of our village board to make our community sustainable for the future. And that's what it really is all about, is having a healthy, sustainable community going into the future.
Post Avenue is off Old Country Road. How do you get a business to come onto Post Avenue when there is more traffic on Old Country Road?
That's a tremendous challenge, and it's a tremendous challenge for a lot of communities on Long Island, whether it's Mineola or Hicksville or Great Neck. There's always competition with the big box stores, with the retail centers that are on the major roads. Westbury has the luxury and the benefit of being in dead center of Nassau County, but the downside of that is we're surrounded by many main arteries and thoroughfares. Roosevelt Field is a mile or so outside of our borders, and you have the whole commercial corridor on Old Country Road and also on Jericho Turnpike that borders us. So, as a downtown or a community that has a downtown, you have to look and say, well, what are my assets, and what, how can I not necessarily compete, with those types of businesses, because, sometimes you can't, but you have to say, how can I complement what's already going on around us so that we're not at their mercy, but providing services and other things that maybe people can't find in those major retail centers.
And in fact, in the past, those major retail centers were blamed, and probably rightly so, for the decline of the small towns. In the town of Hempstead used to be the hub of Nassau County, and then Roosevelt Field and all these other big malls came in and decimated the local businesses. So you're saying complement. So yeah, you cannot compete against those malls. So what did you guys come up with?
I think, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, a lot of that trend developed. And I think it took planners and municipal officials some time to kind of figure that out and figure out how to really manage that for their own communities. It really is just people deciding, local people deciding that, we have a struggling downtown with some of the economic downturns and whatnot over the years. If we want to have a viable community, you have to have a viable commercial district, because that's an important part of your tax base. It's also just an important component of your community. So I think with the development of some smart growth principles that have been developed by Vision Long Island, some other organizations that are on Long Island, and sort of the buy-in by certain communities, in a lot of cases mostly villages. It's interesting that it's maybe harder on a township level or on a county level, but a lot of villages have had a lot of success focusing in on what they needed to do to keep their village viable. I think we did it early on, and so we're maybe a little bit ahead of the curve curve of some other local downtowns. But I think you see now there's a whole string of downtowns in Suffolk County and Nassau County which are kind of getting on the train and doing the kinds of things that are necessary to, as I said, not compete with those commercial centers, but add a new dimension really to suburban life, which is to have these vibrant downtowns with a lot of different things going on, different types of services and food options and entertainment options. Those are the kinds of things you have to do. And some of the communities that have done it have been really successful doing it, and there are some communities that are still resistant to doing it for a lot of reasons, and I think eventually they'll catch on. But it really is just a conscious effort to say, look, and a lot of times it's with somebody like me who's lived in a community my whole life. You say, I don't want my community being on the downside. I want it to have a new life, going forward, and that's what we try to do.
Now, mentioning competition, I mean, how many of these smart growth downtowns can the island support, or do you see that you're not really competing against the other towns and villages? Each one has its own unique feel, and it's not really a competition.
Well, if you talk to Eric Alexander at Vision Long Island, he'll say all the time that Long Island is not just a big region, it's really a composite of all individual, different, unique communities. And each community has its own dimensions, and each community has its own positives and negatives. I think every community has to kind of figure out for itself what approach to take, because there's not, one cookie cutter approach. Not every community is like Westbury, which has a train station and a big, performing arts theater, which we have in our downtown. But other communities, maybe on the water, maybe on the North Shore, have water that is an attraction, or other things that are attractions. So, I think that as there are more and more downtowns that are becoming well developed and having different services and things to draw people, there may be some competition, but I think that that'll be healthy. And it's healthy for Long Island overall because, again, as each individual community figures out its own way through this maze, and becomes successful in and of itself, the whole region will be, more successful. You'll have more sustainable communities, better tax bases, more stable tax bases, and I think that's really what people are looking for. There may be some element of competition there, and sometimes mayors like to compete with themselves as to, whose community gets the most press or whatever it is, but it's really not about that. It's really about making your community sustainable.
Do you think smart growth and the vision for Long Island is a good movement? Let's take a little small town like Bayville. I don't see where they could really grow, if you know what I'm trying to say to you. It's a summer community, basically, but you do have residents living there all year round.
Smart growth is a very broad umbrella, and it doesn't dictate or contemplate, as I said, a cookie-cutter approach. Every community has assets that can be used to make it more attractive to people. Obviously, every different community has a different appetite for commercial development. Every community has a different appetite for residential development, whether that's multifamily residential or just subdivisions, for additional homes. But every community that wants to, I think, be forward-thinking and wants to be concerned about its future has to consider, what do we do to make ourselves sustainable? And it doesn't mean, smart growth doesn't mean just growing beyond your reasonable limits. It means really just a contemplative process of analyzing what you need to do to be sustainable. And even a small village or a small community like Oyster Bay, which has a small downtown, there are things that you can do to add, and I think they've done some of this, to add some open space and some park space so that people can come down and maybe get an ice cream cone and sit and enjoy the water that's not so far off there. So, they have an attribute that places like Middle Island and Westbury and other places don't have. They have water. I think smart growth sometimes gets painted with a very broad brush, and sometimes to its detriment, because people maybe use it as sort of to demonize the whole idea of redevelopment. But I think if there's one thing we've learned over the last 10 or 15 years on Long Island is you cannot stand still, and you have to think of ways to reimagine your communities and redevelop your communities so that they're going to be sustainable into the future. Otherwise, the brain drain will continue, the youth drain will continue. People will not want to stay here. You have to create reasons for people to want to be here, and I think that's what the smart growth movement really is all about.
I think the last time we interviewed you, we were talking about the Westbury Movie Theater.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is quite a performing arts center, shall we say?
That's exactly what it is, yeah.
It's phenomenal.
It's terrific, and it's something which was really important to us. It's one of the capstone projects in our redevelopment. It took a long, neglected and dilapidated building, which, in the old days, everybody used to say to me as a mayor or when I was a trustee, what is with that theater building? It was terrible, and it was really a negative blight on the community. And now it's the opposite. It's really one of our main attributes. It's attracting people into the village. It's creating a buzz and an excitement in the village that is bringing people to see, shows of all different types, live performing shows. It's not a movie theater anymore. And as the mayor, the positive is not one single complaint by anybody about traffic or parking or anything. It's just been a complete home run, really, to be honest with you.
Where do people park now?
That was the biggest challenge in that because, as you know, it takes up the entire block.
Right.
There's no room on site for parking. And the challenge was to figure out, well, how are you going to accommodate all these people that you were hoping were going to come into the theater? We went through a couple of iterations, and the developer went through a couple of iterations. At one point, they were going to build a parking deck. That didn't work out. So we did something which I think was pretty creative. There are 2 municipal parking lots which are within half a block of the theater, which are underutilized at night. In the old days, if you went by there were no cars. They were just empty. So what we did was we cut a deal with the developer and said, to facilitate your building and redevelopment of the theater, we'll lease to you those parking spaces at night. He pays us rent to use them. And so he has the ability to use this probably combined between the 2 lots, 250 spots. And there's other on-street parking, and there are other municipal lots which are a little further away, which people are utilizing. But we haven't had a problem with parking. We've been able to accommodate all the cars and the people who are coming in, which is a great
And
thing.
there's no traffic jam.
You don't have a traffic jam, but you do have a busy downtown when there's something going on at the theater, which is exciting to see.
So let's talk about the process of getting this theater approved. I mean, we've done shows with other mayors and the Vision people. It's all about politicking and convincing people. And so how did the theater project come about, and what kind of roadblocks did you come upon along the way that you were able to overcome? And a lot of towns can't get off dead center. Nobody wants to change anything. What's your secret?
Well, when you're encountering an issue like this, it's always important that you build a consensus not only among your board, your local government, but also a consensus with the business community and with the residential community. There was no doubt that that theater needed to be redeveloped. As I said, there was a long period of time of decay. It was a blight, and people wanted to see something happening there. So then the question really becomes what's appropriate. What's the right size project, and what's the appropriate type of project? We went through a phase where we were considering different things. At one point, there was a multifamily development proposed there. But the developer who ultimately bought the property had in his mind that he wanted to create a performing arts theater. And since the theater shell was still there, he felt that it was a good starting point, and he brought that concept to the village, and we thought that was a great idea. It played into the whole redevelopment effort that we were undertaking at the time. And to be honest with you, the only main stumbling block really in the whole process was the parking situation. We had several public hearings. There was a lot of comment from the public, and most of the people were concerned, or who expressed concerns about traffic and parking. Once we explained to them the approach that we wanted to take, most of the people in our village, at least, were willing to accept take us for our word that it would be adequate because they wanted to see something happening there. We're really fortunate in Westbury that we have a very diverse community, but it's also a very cohesive community. And I think a lot of people understand the needs that we have. A lot of people who have lived in the community a long time, want to make sure it's viable for the future. Some of the new people who are coming in want to make sure it's viable for the future because they've invested their time and their money to come into the village. And the business community obviously has a vested interest in making sure. So when they heard a theater was coming in, obviously we have a business improvement district, which was very excited because that helps their constituent businesses. Our residents were excited because of the tax benefits and the tax roll increase, and also just the elimination of a blighted building. So every project like this has a life of its own. And I think a lot of times you hear of these projects that don't go through in certain places. A lot of times those are the big mega projects that have a really complicated set of issues that for whatever reason just don't come together. If you really look, though, across Long Island and Nassau County in particular, there are thousands of projects that get approved every single year by villages and zoning boards and planning boards that are small projects, but incrementally probably have as big an impact on the economy and on things that are going on and on those individual communities as these mega projects. So even in our case, there are legitimate concerns that are raised. I think if you handle the process in a very open way, you solicit input from the community, all aspects of the community, you can build that consensus that's necessary to get a project that's important for your community done. And I think that in our case, this is a really great example of people understanding the need, people understanding the solution, and now at the end of that process and having the theater actually open, a sense of satisfaction and gratification that it worked, and it's a real attribute to the community.
Now, I'm surprised to hear that the theater was not an idea that was formed in the town, that this guy actually came to you and said, I want to do this. Was that just dumb luck, basically?
No, I don't think it's dumb luck, because I think that obviously if we were putting together a list of things that we would have liked to have seen there, a theater would have been one of them. But it's a private project. It was not a public project. So you're really reliant upon a private person who's willing to come in and invest his dollars in that way. As I said, there were some prior proposals for the site for some residential development that really never went anywhere. And when he came to us with his proposal, it fit into what we were trying to do, and we definitely encouraged it. He did get a lot of relief in terms of zoning relief that he needed to build the project. We did expedite the project in terms of the approval process. We did facilitate that because we saw the benefit of it, and it certainly is something which was logical, having had a historical history on that site of having a theater, and continuing that type of use, even though it's not a movie theater anymore, but a performing arts theater, made sense to us. And that's something we would have wanted to encourage.
So he came to Westbury because the building was there and he was looking to do this kind of project.
I think that's correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the refurbishing of Post Avenue, what more can we see to be done on Post Avenue?
Well, we have a couple of projects that are underway. We have a current redevelopment project which is taking place, which is about a block away from the train station, where we're adding, I think it's 13 apartments, rental apartments with some retail. We have another piece of property that's being aggregated about a block and a half from the train station, which will be a much bigger project, I think, which probably a year from now will be underway, which is a multifamily mixed-use type of a project. And something else which is related is, as you, I'm sure, know, about a year ago we formed an arts council in Westbury. And the reason for doing that was to try to catch some of the tailwinds, and the creative energy that the theater would be throwing off, to sort of bring an arts component into our downtown, into our village. And since we started that process about a year or so ago, it's probably been the most overwhelmingly spontaneously accepted project that we've started. I mean, there's probably 200 people who have signed on to that. We have a board of 20 some odd people. It's got a 501c3 application pending to become a not-for-profit. It's just already had probably half a dozen really exciting and terrific projects that is undertaken, and some of the things they're talking about for the future incorporate some of the downtown stores and some of the restaurants in terms of performing spaces and whatnot. So I'm hoping to see an additional transition of some of the existing stores to some that will be more complementary to the theater that we have, and also with the arts component becoming a bigger part of what we're doing. As
mayor, what are some of your challenges?
It's a really wide open question, but in this, I have to say, in this environment, you never have enough resources to do all the things that you need to do. And in terms of capital projects, especially, over the last several years, many municipalities have been faced with deteriorating roads and infrastructure. And at the same time, there's been revenue sources that have either dried up or been reduced in terms of state aid, in terms of sales tax revenue and other types of revenue. So local municipalities are constantly being squeezed to have to provide the services that they need to provide, including road work and other things, and having the resources without raising taxes to do those things. As a village official, we're always railing against state mandates that government is telling us to do more and not providing funds to do that. So those are some challenges. Every day, really brings a new challenge, but that's part of the job, and that's what really makes it exciting. But I would say that those capital needs that are really important for your infrastructure are things that really not only the state really has to really take a look at over the coming years, but also the whole nation in terms of upgrading all the infrastructure that we have, roads and highways and all those kinds of things.
And I guess municipal workers, it's cheaper and more efficient to have them on the town payroll than to hire companies to do outside jobs on an as-needed basis kind of thing? I mean, I guess you looked at these kind of things all the time.
That depends on the service, that you're providing. And we've looked at this in different types of services. And there are some things that we do outsource. We don't do our own internal paving. We let those contracts out to external contractors. But there are other services like garbage disposal and pickup and whatnot that we do have, we do inside. And we've looked at that from time to time as to whether or not it makes sense for us to privatize that or to keep it as one of the services that we do internally. And the analysis has always come back that even if it's a wash in terms of economically, we think we can provide a better service by having control of that process as opposed to outsourcing that to somebody else. But that's a process that we as municipal officials go through every year when we do budgets, is to determine how we can do things more efficiently. Every year, you try to come up with a couple of ways to re-engineer, a department that you might have, reallocate resources, but still provide the services. And I think probably going forward into the future, especially with the governor's budget proposal this past year about sharing services and trying to have municipalities and school districts cooperate in terms of providing services. I think you're going to see more and more of that happening between villages and school districts and local districts where you're sharing services or doing things together so that it kind of makes it more efficient.
Is that just an economic reality? Because we've done shows where every town wants their own school board. They want, they want control of every aspect of their little area. And in the past, that's been a huge roadblock to getting things done. You're saying that people are now coming around to realizing that they can't continue to have that position?
Well, I think that you're always going to have a tendency to have to want to control, the services that are being provided locally. I mean, the reason we have 64 villages in Nassau County was because every community wanted to kind of control its services and its zoning and whatnot. What I'm saying is, I think it's going to be, probably the school district consolidation that some people have asked to see, probably going to be a much harder thing to accomplish. But I think in terms of sharing municipal services, in terms of having intermunicipal agreements with neighboring towns or villages to provide services together, or to, you'll plow my snow and I'll pick up your leaves, or those kinds of things. I think those make a lot of sense, and I think there are economies that can be gained by that. As you look at, though, consolidating departments and services, sometimes it's not cost effective. I think the economic realities are on Long Island where we have a very high real property tax that every community pays, and that it's up to us in government to look for ways to do that as cheaply and as efficiently as possible. It's always going to be expensive just because of the nature of where we are and the services that we provide, but I think we have to constantly look, and we do that in the village of Westbury. Every year when we do our budget, we look at every line item to figure out how to provide that service as economically as we can. So I think depending on the service that's being provided, sometimes it makes sense to outsource it, sometimes it doesn't. That's a decision you have to make on a case-by-case basis.
And what about the patronage system that exists all over the place?
That's a political issue, and as a village mayor, we don't run on partisan lines, but, all I can speak of is my village, and we run really very lean. And if you ask my village clerk, who's responsible for running the village on a day-to-day basis, we don't have, a man to spare. There's probably some of that elsewhere, but I can honestly say in the village of Westbury, we really run lean, and that's not an issue for us. But on, a county level or state level or a town level, there's probably a little bit more of that, but, that's maybe a fact of politics, unfortunately.
Being a lifelong resident of Westbury, where do you see Westbury, say, 10 years from now?
It's interesting you asked me that because I actually have a meeting tonight. It's the annual meeting of our Business Improvement District, and one of the things I'm going to do is to challenge them because I saw recently a list, I think in the Long Island Business News, of the list of the top 5 downtowns in Long Island or in Nassau, I think on Long Island. And I said, well, I don't know why Westbury is not on that list. So I want to be, really 10 years from now, maybe sooner, hopefully, really one of the premier downtown communities where people want to come and spend their time, want to live and want to work. We have a tremendous location, which is ideally suited, better than just about any other community I can think of on Long Island. And I think that if we continue to do the kinds of things that we're doing, we can be one of those really premier locations and premier communities that I'm talking about.
I really feel Westbury is really the one that is going ahead with some of these projects because I've been to Mineola and I didn't see that much going on. I feel Westbury is kind of like the leader of the pack, so to speak.
Well, I think we're one of the communities that's been more active. There are a lot of communities that have really done a lot of good work in this area. And Mineola has, frankly. I mean, they have a different type of downtown. It's more spread out. They have the hospital there, so that sort of is a different type of a situation. That's one of their attributes, one of their benefits, that they have that type of an employer that's in their village, and they can do some things that a village like ours really can't do in terms of some of the things that they've done. But there are a lot of local communities that have done a good job about it. Where I want Westbury to be is I want us to be on the forefront. I want us to continue to reimagine where we should be, because I think it's all about making your community sustainable and all about making it desirable for people to want to live. I've lived there my whole life. I really can't imagine myself really living anywhere else. And I want other people to feel that way about the community. And I think that by doing some of the things we're doing, hopefully we're fostering that sense of community.
Would we ever see an apartment building in Westbury as considered affordable housing?
When this question is raised, I always say a couple of things. And first is Westbury, by its nature, has more affordable housing per capita probably than just about any other community. Our housing stock, if you compare it to the surrounding areas, is much more affordable, and there's a variety of reasons for that. We have plentiful rental housing, legal rental housing. We're developing more multifamily rental housing in the community. And as you know, there are incentives and certain requirements that the state has that if you're getting certain types of relief for zoning and you're building higher density residential housing, that a certain proportion of that has to be dedicated to affordable housing. But I think that Westbury, frankly, in central Nassau County is probably one of the most affordable places to live in terms of the rents that you can find, the housing prices. That is always a goal, is to kind of complement everything else that we're doing by including an affordability component. But I think our community as a whole is much more affordable than most of the surrounding areas.
So these ideas for improving the community, how much of them are generated by the town, and how much do you look to outside people, whether the businesses or private individuals, to come to you with ideas and then go from there?
There's a tremendous amount of thinking on this that's taking place on Long Island right now, and there are a lot of organizations. I mentioned Vision Long Island, there's Sustainable Long Island, there's other organizations so there's a lot of resources that people can go to for these types of ideas. My role as the mayor is really to present leadership and to kind of present a vision of where we think the community needs to be, and then you try to, as I said before, you try to create a consensus that people agree with that allows you to move forward. So I always say this too at our public hearings. The benefit of having public hearings is, we're not the smartest people in the room, and people have great ideas. So you get a lot of input from residents and from business owners, and a lot of times these projects that you're doing are improved by the suggestions that you get by people that are in the general public or the business community. There's a lot of thinking on this going on, and people can really tap into that either by talking to the Village Officials Association, which I'm on the executive board of, or talking to Vision Long Island or some of the other organizations that do this stuff. It's really a matter of leadership, in a local community, of somebody taking the reins and saying, this is what we need to do to make our community better, and then going forward with it.
So you'll go to meetings and there'll be people arguing on both sides and sometimes heated, and it's your job to basically bring everybody together and iron out some kind of compromise where either everybody's happy or just usually not possible, but everybody is satisfied that...
Yes. Yeah. Usually the case is that nobody is 100% happy with the result because they didn't get everything they wanted, but you put together a compromise, if that's the way to phrase it, a compromise that sort of meets a lot of everybody's interests and needs that they're willing to support. And that's really what it's about, is really building a consensus of the best way to go forward. And most people understand that they're not going to get exactly 100% of what they want. The developers know when they come in with a project, they're not going to get 100% of what they've asked for. And they expect that you're going to negotiate and scale it down and modify it. And the residents know that there are certain constraints that village government or any government have in terms of some of these projects. As long as the end product is something that everybody can live with and support, then that's really what the goal is. And that, again, comes down to leadership and, as you said, bringing the parties together and hammering it out. And I think that most people, who have goodwill and want to see the right thing happen are willing to participate in that process, and it makes the process better. And
there is a consensus in Westbury that you do want to move forward. You don't want to stay where you are and not change.
That's my perception, and I ran on these ideas, and I've been elected twice, and I think that I always like to say the proof is in the pudding. I think it's been successful, and I think that people are happy with the changes and the improvements that have taken place. So I think, yes, we do have a consensus of some of the things that we've done.
Keep up the good work.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you, Peter Cavallaro, Mayor of Westbury, for joining us here on Long Island Community Spotlight on 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University.